Okay, so now that the neck and spine have controllers and they are working, that's all set up. The next thing that we can do is we can make controllers for the hips and the hips override. So you know that we have the two joints in place right in here. So what we want to do is open up the outliner and view them in there so that we can see where they are. And the hips are right here. The hips override should be below here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize everything in between so I can see the hips and the hips override. So I'm going to minimize my outliner. I'm going to create two NURBS circles. So what I can do is go up to create, down to NURBS primitives, and circle. Again, I'm making sure that interactive creation is turned off. That way when I click on circle, it creates it. And I can scale it up right away. And this is going to be based off the character. We have a super slender character, so when we move this thing up, we can adjust it accordingly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap it to the joints right here. I'm going to hit W for my move tool, or to evoke my move tool. I'm going to hold down V, and I can hold my middle mouse button and move it around. Okay, V is going to allow it to snap there. I'll hit F to frame it. Okay, so based off of my character, at least the geometry anyhow, I'm going to bring that back and see that that's pretty wide for the character. I'm going to scale it down a little bit, like so. And I'm going to name it. So instead of NURBS Circle 1, I'm going to call it Hips Manip. If you want to put Manipulator, that's fine. Let's put Manipulator in there. Hips Manipulator. Having this selected, I will duplicate it by hitting Control D or going up to Edit, down to Duplicate. And where's my duplicate? There it is. Once it's duplicated, I can scale it down a little bit because it's going to be within the hips manipulator, since the hips manipulator is going to kind of take the entire body with it, or control the majority of the joints, depending on your setup. And the hips override manipulator is what we're going to call this. So hips override manipulator is going to control the hips override joint. So what we're going to do is select both of these, and we're going to go up to Edit, down to Delete by Type, and delete the history. Also going to go up to Modify and down to Freeze Transformations. That way we can zero everything out in here and set the scales to 1, which is equivalent to 100%. Now, what we do want to do is we're going to take this hips override manipulator, and it's going to be on the hips override joint. And what that allows us to do is have that follow in the same fashion that the joint follows. So the hips override joint is going to follow the hips joint. So we're going to do the same thing with our controllers here. I'm going to select my hips override manipulator, shift select my hips manipulator, and hit P to parent it. So that if I select my hips manipulator, the hips override, you can see, is going to come with it. It's highlighted in green. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to constrain these objects, or rather constrain the joints that these objects are going to drive. So in this case, I'm going to come up to Window and open up my outliner again. And this is where I'm going to make use of the hips and hips override joints. Okay. The first one I'll do is the hips. So since we're going to use a constraint, we have to select the parent first and shift select the child. In this case, this will drive the hips, and this is the hips manipulator. So I first select the hips manipulator, hold down Control, click on the hips. Going to go up to constrain, and I'm going to go down to parent option box, and the only thing that I want to make sure of is that maintain offset is turned on. If you want, it's a good way of working to go to edit, reset the settings, and then if this is off, turn it back on. And that's just a good way of working at the school, especially. When somebody else was on the computer, you never know who's going to change those settings for you. And what I'm going to do here is click add, and basically you're going to see that I should have a connection now. If I select the hips joint, my translates and rotates are set to blue, showing that they're linked. Okay? If I select the hips manipulator, I can test it by pulling this up and down. That's working good. And rotating it. Very good. Okay, so that's a pretty good setup. The next thing that we're going to do is select the hips override manipulator first. Hold down Control and select its corresponding joint, which is the hips override joint. And the type of constraint that we're going to put on it is going to be an orient constraint. So this is going to be the hip shake, the pelvis thrust for the character, giving us a little more control. Now again, in the option box of the orient constraint options, we want to make sure that maintain offset is on. If you want, go ahead and click edit down to reset settings, turn on maintain offset once again, and click add. So basically what we have is now the hips override is going to have its rotations following the rotation of the hips override manip or manipulator. Now in this case, you always want to, before testing it, you always want to deselect the joint. In this case, I just click on the hips override manipulator. You can tell that that's the only thing selected. If you have something like this, and I'll just shift select something else, okay, like the hips manipulator, anytime you see a dot dot dot, that indicates that you have more than one object selected. So what I'm going to do is click right there on the hips override manipulator, and I'm going to test it by rotating it. So we have the thrust there, that's working. So the hips are going to go with it. And the side to side. So if this was a female character, we can get the boom bada boom, right? After testing, either zero these out or undo once until this gets back into place. Make sure you look down here in this little black bar, because if you go too far, it's going to say undo constraint. And I'll do a little example. So I'll hit Control Z, and I probably have to click here, Control Z. And I'll do that till I see. Okay, here's the callback. You can't see everything, but it's a callback of the constraint that I put on there. So if I test it, nothing's happening. Okay, so that's what you want to be careful about and of, is losing that feature that you just added, or that connection that you just added, by undoing too many times, because you could try to work fast and hit Control Z too many times. So what I'll do is select the hips override manip, hold down Control, click on the hips override, the actual joint, and I'm going to add that again. So I'll go to Constraint, Orient option box, make sure that maintains offset is on, and click Add. I'll test it one more time, so I'll deselect everything, just select only the hips override manip. That's working. That's working. Undo once. Save it. And then we'll move on to the next steps, which is going to create some more manipulators and adding different things like the eyes, eye controls, get that movement.